At first, I welcome you all to RK's economics class. Students, today in this class we will discuss regarding Keynesian theory of income determination. How Keynes has given his theory on equilibrium level of on the determination of equilibrium level of income and employment in an economy. A very simple theory he has given, and that we will discuss today in this class. But before starting our discussion, let me request you all to subscribe the channel if you have not subscribed the channel yet. Thank you. So we will start our discussion. John Maynard Keynes has given a simple theory of income determination. Keynes, who is regarded as father of macroeconomics, has given the simple theory of income determination in his famous book, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Remember the name of the book? In this book, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which was published in the year 1936, he has given his theory of income determination. How equilibrium level of income can be determined in an economy, that is discussed in his book, General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. According to Keynes, equilibrium level of income and employment in an economy mainly depends on effective demand. You see, what is effective demand? And what Keynes said, that equilibrium level of income and employment in an economy mainly depends on effective demand. What is effective demand? Effective demand refers to a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. That point of demand where aggregate demand and aggregate supply equals each other, when an equality is attained in between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What is the aggregate supply? That is the aggregate demand in that economy. Then that sort of demand is known as effective demand. So remember this. Equilibrium level of income and employment in an economy mainly depends on effective demand, and effective demand refers to a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. We have already discussed the concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply in our channel. So please go through that topic for clear understanding, right? So you see, effective demand refers to a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. AD is equal to AS. That is the point. AD becomes equal to AS. And that is the point of effective demand. Right? Then an increase or decrease in effective demand causes an increase or decrease in income and employment level. When your effective demand increases, then there will be an increase in the income and employment level in that economy. In other way, inversely you can say that if there is a decrease in effective demand, it will cause a decrease in income and employment level. Therefore, aggregate demand and aggregate supply are considered as two important determinants of income and employment level in an economy. Equilibrium level of income and employment is determined at that point where AD becomes equal to AS, aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply. Remember this. Then we will discuss this theory, or for the better explanation of this Keynes theory of income and employment, we will briefly discuss the concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply again, and how with the help of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, with their interaction, the equilibrium level of income and employment can be determined in an economy. That we will discuss now. First of all, what is aggregate demand? Let us say, what is aggregate demand? You see, what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand, the amount of money spent on purchasing the final goods and services produced within an economy in a given year is known as aggregate demand. what amount we have spent in a given year, what amount we have spent during a particular time period for purchasing the goods and services in an economy. That is known as aggregate expenditure. And what is aggregate expenditure? That is only aggregate demand. So, aggregate demand means the amount of money spent on purchasing the final goods and services produced with an economy in a given year, right? Aggregate demand is also known as aggregate expenditure. How to measure aggregate demand? Through aggregate expenditure. What is total expenditure? That is total demand, right? So, aggregate demand comprises of four things. We know there are four components of aggregate demand. There, number one is household consumption demand, number two is private investment demand, number three is government's demand for goods and services, and number four is net export demand. Number one is household consumption demand. By individuals and households, we demand goods and services for consumption, and it mainly depends on income, right? Next, private investment demand, which is symbolized as I. Private investment demand for expenditure on capital goods, expenditure to increase the productive capacity of a country, that is private investment demand. Number three is government's demand for goods and services. We all know that to provide public utility services for social welfare or public welfare, government spends money and demands goods and services. That is known as government's demand for goods and services, which is symbolized at G. And number four is net export demand. What we demand from other countries, what we import, and what other countries demand from us. That is known as net export demand. And this excess demand by foreign countries is also a part of aggregate demand. Net export demand, which is symbolized as X minus M, right? So, we can say that aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Household consumption demand plus private investment demand plus government's demand for goods and services plus net export demand. That is all about aggregate demand. And you see, generally demand for goods and services are made either for the purpose of consumption or purpose of investment. Why we need goods and services? Either for consumption or for purpose of investment, right? So, for this it is said that aggregate demand is a combination of consumption demand and investment demand, right? So, in short, we have written that first of all we have discussed that AD is the combination of or comprises of four components, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Then we again said that if we elaborate these points, then we found that demand for goods and services are made either for consumption or for investment. That's why you see, symbolically it is written as aggregate demand AD is equal to C plus I. Aggregate demand is equal to consumption demand plus investment demand, right? Then in an economy, aggregate demand is affected by income level. We already know that demand always refers to income. Demand is according to income level, right? So, there is direct relationship between income level and aggregate demand. If your income increases, your demand for goods and services will increase. If your income reduces, your demand for goods and service will decrease, right? So, the relationship between two, you see, is shown in the following table. That is table given here, right? In this table, this relationship is shown. You see, in the first column, there are two columns in the table, aggregate demand schedules. In this schedule, two columns are given. Number one is income. In the first column, income is written, and in the second column, aggregate demand is mentioned. Income goes like this. when income was 0 in an economy, aggregate demand was 15 crores rupees. There was no income, but aggregate demand was there, right, which is known as autonomous demand, autonomous consumption, autonomous expenditure. You have to spend money to live. Anyhow, you have to live, that's why you have to spend, you have to consume some goods and services, whether you earn income or not, right. This is known as autonomous consumption, autonomous expenditure point. And after that, when income goes on increasing from 0 to 10 crores rupees to 20 crores rupees, again to 30 crores rupees, again to 40 crores rupees, as it increases, goes on increasing, aggregate demand also goes on increasing from 15 crores rupees to 20 crores, then 25 crores rupees, then 30 crores rupees, then 35 crores rupees, right. This is the way how aggregate demand increases with an increase in income, right. So it is seen that aggregate demand increases with an increase in income level in the economy. At zero income also it was 15 crores, it is wrongly written, it is 15 crores. Aggregate demand was 15 crores rupees. 15 crores rupees. Aggregate demand increases with an increase in income level, right. Then you see it is this table, in this table the relationship between income and aggregate demand is given. Now we will discuss it through a diagram. We will represent it in a diagram. You see, in this diagram it is represented, AD is the aggregate demand curve. You see here, OX axis we are taking income level, in OY axis we are taking aggregate demand, AD. Then this is the aggregate demand curve as per our table. We have drawn it. This is the aggregate demand curve, and aggregate demand curve shows the desired level of expenditure by consumption and firms, by consumers and firms corresponding to each level of income. Generally, goods are demanded by consumers as well as firms for consumption as well as for investment. So aggregate demand curve is an upward sloping curve. You see here, when zero level of income was there, aggregate demand was 15 crores rupees, right. With an increase in income level to 10 crores rupees, 20 crores rupees, 30 crores rupees and 40 crores rupees, aggregate demand also increases to 20 crores, from 15 crores rupees to 20 crores, 25, 30, 35 crores in this way. So AD curve is an upward sloping curve. Why it is an upward sloping curve? Because aggregate demand increases with an increase in income. So this aggregate demand curve is also known as C plus I curve, right, because it is consumption demand plus investment demand curve, right. And why it is known as C plus D curve? Because aggregate demand comprises of consumption expenditure as well as investment expenditure. So this is all about, you see, aggregate demand. In briefly we have discussed what is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is nothing but the total expenditure made on goods and services during a given period, right. It mainly depends on income level. When income level in an economy increases, aggregate demand also increases. When income level decreases, aggregate demand decreases. So with an increase in income level in an economy, aggregate demand increases. So there is always a direct relationship between income level and aggregate demand. And this is already discussed with a table, in tabular way as well as in diagrammatic presentation, right. Next we will discuss what is aggregate supply. You see, what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply refers to the flow of all the goods and services in an economy during a given year. How much goods and services flow in an economy during a particular period of time, that is known as aggregate supply. These goods and services are supplied either by individuals, firms or government. Aggregate supply price is the total amount of money which all the producers in an economy receive from the sale of the output during a given year. What is the total sale of goods and services? How much income the producers are receiving in that from the sale of goods and services during the given period, that is known as aggregate supply price. So it is the sum total of all factor incomes like rent, wage, profit and interest. So aggregate supply refers to aggregate income in a country. Remember this, that aggregate supply means it refers to flow of goods and services in an economy during a given year, and it is nothing but the sum total of factor incomes. This is why aggregate supply is also known as aggregate income. So as a part of aggregate income spent on consumption, how we spent our income, what we are doing with our income, either for consumption we spend it or for saving. One part for consumption is used for consumption, other part for saving. We save that amount. So aggregate supply is the sum total of consumption and saving. That's why it is written as AS is equal to C plus S. Aggregate supply is consumption plus saving. Aggregate supply in an economy increases with an increase in the level of employment. You see, in aggregate demand we have discussed that there is a direct link in between income level and aggregate demand. But in aggregate supply, AS, think of aggregate supply. In aggregate supply, there is a link between employment level and total supply of goods and services. Right. So aggregate supply in an economy increases with an increase in level of employment. Employment level increases, it means there will be an increase in aggregate supply. Employment level falls means there will be a fall in aggregate supply. We will see it in the following table, right? You see, in the following table we have discussed it, we have clarified it. In this table you see of aggregate supply, employment level is given in the first column, employment level is given in the first column, and in the second column aggregate supply is given. Total employment is given in thousands as well as aggregate, but aggregate supply is given in crores of rupees, right? So aggregate, you see, from this table we know that as the employment level goes on increasing from 0 to 10,000, from 10,000 to 20,000 to 30,000 to 40,000, at that time aggregate supply increases to 10 crores rupees, 20 crores rupees, 30 crores rupees, 40 crores rupees. So there is what we have marked here, what we have observed here, there is a direct and proportional relationship between aggregate employment level and aggregate supply. There is a direct and proportional relationship. Direct relationship means they both go in the same way. Proportional means to the same amount, to the same proportion, there has been either increase or decrease in the aggregate supply as per the employment level. So that is shown in this table. Next we will represent this table in a diagram, right? You see, this is the diagram. In this diagram, aggregate employment level is taken on y-x axis and aggregate supply on y-axis, right? This is aggregate supply AS, this is employment level, and AS is the aggregate supply curve. And this aggregate supply curve is depicted by a 45-degree line. You see, this is 45 degree. This is 45-degree line. It is a 45-degree line. AS curve is depicted by a 45-degree line starting from the origin O. Right, from this point it is a 45-degree line. Why this is a 45-degree line? Because of the same proportional increment of the aggregate supply due to the increase in employment level, right. So, this is how aggregate, what is aggregate supply and how aggregate supply is depicted, what is the how aggregate supply curve is given, it is represented in this diagram. Now, after discussing the aggregate demand and aggregate supply in brief, now let us go to the determination of income and employment level in an economy through a combination of these two, through an interaction of these two concepts, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right. Let us go. You see, in this, equilibrium level of income and employment can be determined at a point where aggregate demand in an economy becomes equal to aggregate supply. What is aggregate demand? What is aggregate supply? We have already discussed. Now, how equilibrium level of income can be attained in an economy, that we are discussing now. So, equilibrium level of income and employment can be determined at a point where AD is equal to AS. Remember this, AD is equal to AS, that is the main point, aggregate demand, that is a point of effective demand. In the following table, how equilibrium level of income and employment is determined by interaction of AD and AS is shown. You see, we have taken 3 columns are given in this table. First of all, employment level oblique income. In the first column, employment level is taken in thousands, whereas income is taken in crores of rupees. That we have to clearly write, right. Then in the second column, aggregate demand is taken in crores of rupees. In the third column, aggregate supply in crores of rupees is given, right. The same table, the same data, that the imaginary table we have taken in aggregate demand and one we are discussing regarding aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That is only this table shows a combination, a combined table of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you see. So, when employment level and income is given in first column, aggregate demand in second column, aggregate supply in third column. Accordingly, we have given the figures. Employment level, when we see, when employment level was 30,000, aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply. Aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply when the employment level was 30,000 in an economy, or when income level was 30 crores of rupees, income level was 30 crores of rupees when aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply. When aggregate demand was 30 crores rupees and aggregate supply was 30 crores rupees, both becomes equal, the AD becomes equal to AS, and at that point, that is the equilibrium point, at that point, our employment level was 30,000 and income level was 30 crores rupees. So, it is known as equilibrium level of income and employment, right. Now, we will represent this in a combined diagram. You see, in this diagram, we have taken income and employment in OX axis, income and employment both are taken, and in OY axis, aggregate demand and aggregate supply taken. AD is the aggregate demand curve, AS is the aggregate supply curve. They intersect each other at point E. This is point E, equilibrium point, right. This is equilibrium point where AD and AS intersects each other. AD and AS, aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve, intersects each other. That means it is the point where aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply, right. 30 crores rupees both. So, this point is known as point E, which is equilibrium point, and according to the equilibrium point, equilibrium level of income is determined as 30 crores rupees and equilibrium level of employment is known as 30,000, right. So, this is point T, write down this is point T, right. So, from the above schedule it is seen that with an increase in employment and income level, both aggregate demand and aggregate supply in an economy increases, right. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply increases with an increase in income as well as employment level. When employment level was 30,000, at AD becomes equal to AS. At this point the level of income is 30 crores rupees. This equilibrium level of employment and income this is the equilibrium level of income and employment is employment in the economy, right. So, you see, after discussing these concepts, what is aggregate demand, what is aggregate supply, then how equilibrium level of income and employment can be determined with the help of aggregate demand and aggregate supply AD and AS. After discussing all this, we will discuss this very important concept. You see, in the above diagram, ADS, aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, we have written this respectively. AD and AS intersect each other at point E, right. Point E is in equilibrium point, point E is the equilibrium point, this is the equilibrium point, right. This is the equilibrium point, point E is the equilibrium point, right. Then you see, as per this equilibrium point, equilibrium level of employment is 30,000 and equilibrium level of income is 30 crores rupees. Now, we will come to a deduction that at this equilibrium level of income and employment, we know that aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. AD is equal to AS. So, it implies that what is aggregate demand? What is aggregate demand? AD is equal to AS. Aggregate demand is equal to, we know that aggregate demand is consumption demand plus investment demand, C plus I. What is aggregate supply? C plus S, consumption plus saving, right. From this equation we can say that it implies that when C plus I becomes equal to C plus S, it implies that I is equal to S, right. I is equal to X, investment is equal to saving, or we can say that saving is equal to investment, right. Understand? We know that equilibrium level of income and output in a country can be determined at that point where AD becomes equal to AS. AD is equal to C plus I, AS is equal to C plus S. This implies that I becomes equal to S or S becomes equal to I. So, from this deduction we have come to the conclusion that the equilibrium level of income is determined at a level when savings in an economy becomes equal to investment. Remember this important statement. When equilibrium level of income and employment can be attained at that point when savings in the economy becomes equal to investment, or S becomes S is equal to I. Remember this. So, this is the very, in brief we have discussed how income and employment level can be determined in an economy through Keynes theory, simple theory, and we understood the whole thing. If there is short time in your exam, very limited time is there, you have to write, you have to attend the answer, then please write the introduction concept that in an economy the equilibrium level of income and employment can be determined with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and equilibrium level of income and output can be attained at that point where AD becomes equal to AS, then simply write what is aggregate demand, what is aggregate supply, then write down the combined interaction concept, that is how with aggregate demand and aggregate supply the equilibrium level of income can be attained in an economy. So, that is all for today's discussion. Thank you all. Again, I request you to like, share and give your comments if you like or dislike. Then subscribe the channel if you want to get any prior notification regarding our next videos. Thank you all. Thank you. All the best for your exams.